Some research methodology questions in your thesis defense can be incredibly broad, while others can be so specific and detailed that they might catch you completely off guard. But here's the interesting thing. Almost every methodology question your professor could ask actually falls into a few predictable categories. Once you know these categories and understand the secret pattern, then nothing they ask would truly surprise you. Today, we're going to walk through 7 difficult methodology questions students struggle with. I will show you how to answer them clearly and confidently, and I will share with you the pattern and categories that underlie these questions. Question number 1. Why did you choose this research method instead of something else? This is one of the most common research methodological questions that professors ask. It sounds simple, but it's actually not necessarily that easy. Because to answer this question well, I need to show that I understand multiple research methods and that I chose mine for a reason. What professors are testing here is whether you can justify your choice among the various research methods that could have worked for your thesis. A good structure to follow is this. First, briefly state your research method. Second, mention one alternative methodological approach that you considered. And third, explain why your chosen method fits your research question best. For example, you could say something like, I did consider conducting interviews to investigate the issue and explore different aspects of it. But ultimately, I chose a survey approach because it enabled me to measure perceptions more closely across a larger sample. Additionally, the quantitative survey results would allow me to compare responses in a statistical and systematic manner, which gave me, I believe, a more accurate and reliable foundation for identifying patterns and drawing my conclusions. Something like that. It shows that you actually considered different research methods and did not choose blindly. Number 2, how did you ensure reliability and validity? This is one tricky question because, first of all, some might not even know off the top of their head what exactly is reliability and validity, or the difference between the two. And second of all, even if you could recall the definitions of these two things, that's not what the professors are looking for. They want to know precisely what you actually did to ensure that your research was reliable and valid as much as possible. So the best strategy here is to mention concrete actions. For example, you might say, to construct my survey, I used previously published and validated scales to measure my variables. Upon completion of data collection and before my full data analysis to answer my research questions, I tested internal consistency by calculating Cronbach's alpha in SPSS to ensure reliability. Number 3. What are the limitations of your method? This one might sound a little scary. We might feel, if we admit to limitations, this would make the thesis seem weaker and problematic. But that's not true. Every study has limitations. Even the papers your professors publish in peer-reviewed journals, they have limitations. What the professors are looking for is whether you are self-aware and can articulate research methodological limitations in a research-like, scholarly manner. A solid answer would look something like this. State one limitation that is indeed related to your research methodology, not some personal circumstance. Explain why this limitation existed. Show how you tried to minimize it, then wrap up by indicating why your results are still meaningful. And if you could, you might want to mention a future research recommendation to go with your limitation. You could say something like, well, my sample size was rather modest, which could limit generalizability. However, I mitigated this by defining the scope of my research very clearly and made sure that participants met my criteria. And I believe, even with this limitation, the findings of my study provided practical and useful insights for organization XYZ, where I did my internship and performed my thesis research. In my discussion chapter, I have put forth the recommendation that future research seeks to replicate my findings in other organizational settings to strengthen the robustness and generalizability of my research. Number 4, how did you deal with bias in your research? Bias is a broad term, and if your professor asks you this question, they are probably testing you on a few things. Do you know what research-related biases there are? Which ones might be relevant to your research, and what did you do to tackle it? The most common biases that student researchers need to think about are self-report bias. Participants give answers that they think look good. This is also sometimes known as social desirability bias. sampling bias, that the sample does not represent the population and that only those who have something to say or want to be heard would agree to participate. Researcher or interviewer bias, that your own expectations influence how you elicit answers, for example in an interview. In other words, the way I ask the question can influence how my interviewees answer it. Common method bias, especially relevant if your data comes from the same source at the same time using the same data collection instrument. In our answers, we want to show that we're aware of these biases and that we did something about them. For self-report bias, you could say something like, I was very aware of potential self-report and social desirability bias, so I made sure that the survey was anonymous and confidential, and I emphasized in my survey introduction that there are no right or wrong answers, so that participants could answer freely and truthfully. For sampling bias, you could say something like, yes, since I used a non-probability sample, sampling bias cannot be completely ruled out. But to manage it, I defined my target population clearly, used consistent inclusion criteria, and distributed the survey through different channels to avoid overrepresentation by any one particular group. For interviewer bias, we could say something like, to minimize interviewer bias, I used the same semi-structured interview guide for all participants, and I kept my follow-up questions generally consistent. And during data analysis, I coded the data anonymously and systematically to keep interpretations grounded in the transcribed data. For common method bias, I could say something like, I was very aware of the potential of common method bias, which was why I actually paired up employee surveys with supervisor responses. This way, the key variables were measured separately from two different sources. Hopefully, you indeed did some of these things to address these biases. If you didn't, well, phrase them as a limitation, as we have just discussed earlier. Question number 5. If you were to do this again, what would you do differently? What would you change methodologically? You might think that this is a really difficult question, that this is a bit of a trap. Well, actually, more likely than not, this is just a lazy question. Because the professor can ask this question to anyone, regardless what your thesis was about or what your research method was. Even if I did not read your thesis at all, I could still ask you this question, just like I can ask you, what is the biggest lesson you have learned from conducting this research? Or what surprised you the most in this whole process? What have you learned from that? These are just some generic lazy questions that professors sometimes ask to fill the time. So, no need to panic, just give a balanced answer. Say something like, oh, the overall research design worked as planned. Everything worked out well. But if I could extend the data collection period a little bit further, I would be able to reach a more diverse sample. So phrase it as a potential improvement for future research, not as an apology. Number 6, about sample sizes. I see you have a sample size of 64 for your survey. How did you arrive at this number? Is it adequate? How would you justify your sample size? This is a difficult question because most students do not have the luxury to get the perfect sample size. Come to think of it, nobody does. I don't think I've ever heard any researcher say, my sample size was too big. To get to this sample size was too easy. Never happens. Now, if your faculty has a very clear black and white rule, for instance, for quantitative research you must have a sample size of 120 respondents, then obviously you should do everything you can to get to that number. But the fact is, sometimes there are legitimate reasons why that sample size cannot be reached. For example, if you are doing your thesis research at a company and that company has only 70 employees and you are doing an employee survey, then it's impossible to get to 120. So in that situation, you could say, for my thesis research, the population size itself capped the sample size. I surveyed all 70 employees in the organization and received 64 responses. So the sample is appropriate because it reflects the absolute majority of employees in that company. Additionally, the company size and my intended sample size were also clarified in my research proposal. So I'd say my sampling method and the achieved sample size are both correct. If you're interested in this topic of sample size justification, I have this whole other video in which I discuss different factors relevant to sample size determination and justification. Sample sizes depend on different things, like population size, sampling method, the amount of variables being measured, the number of effects that we're testing, the expected effect sizes, the relative sensitivity of the research topic and accessibility of the population, qualitative versus quantitative research design, data analytical approach, and the characteristics of the population. Is it diverse or homogeneous? So truly, there are many factors that determine how big a sample can and should be. So check out this other video of mine if you're interested. Number 7, why is this method suitable for your research? This is the alignment question. Professors ask this question to see whether there is a clear, logical red thread that runs through your chosen topic, research question, methodological design, and collected data. So for questions like this one, the most important thing to highlight is to show that everything in your research logically connects. You could say something like, because my research question focuses on examining the relationship between variables x and y, a quantitative method would be the most suitable. It allows the variables to be accurately measured and the relationship to be statistically calculated and established. Or if you did qualitative work, you could highlight the exploratory nature of your study. Say something like, because my research explores experiences and meanings, interviews would be the most suitable as they capture depth and nuance and allow previously unknown aspects and perspectives to surface. Now, the last point, the secret categories and pattern. Professors can ask a lot of questions on research methodology. They can ask something very generic, like why did you choose this research method? Or they can focus on something very small and very detailed, like a specific step in your sampling process. But if you think about it, almost every methodology question belongs to one of 4 core areas. Sampling, so things like sample size, probability and non-probability sampling methods, and sample representativeness. Data collection instruments, mostly about how you developed your qualitative or quantitative instruments and how you operationalized concepts into clear questions for data collection. Research quality considerations such as validity, reliability, and generalizability. And finally, research ethics, so things like voluntary participation, informed consent, confidentiality, privacy, and data storage, things like that. Once we understand these 4 main pillars, most methodological questions become largely predictable. It is certainly possible that the professors would jump around a little bit. Maybe one question is about your data collection instrument, and then they ask you about validity and generalizability, and after that, they question you on research ethics. They don't necessarily stay in just one category, they jump around and mix and match, and that's okay. It's also possible that their questions would focus on the connection among these different elements. So they would ask you about why your research design makes sense overall, or how these different elements actually fit coherently together. And if your university requires that you include in your methodology chapter a subsection on data analysis approach, then it's also possible professors might ask you about your choices for data analysis methods. But this depends. Some programs include this in method, others don't. Like I mentioned earlier, once we know these main areas about which professors could raise questions, then no matter what they ask, it should not catch us completely off guard. Whatever their question, it should be at least manageable. Do check out my other videos on thesis defense. I am sure you will find them helpful and interesting. And please leave your thoughts and comments down below. Share your experiences regarding your thesis defense. Let's help the next batch of students survive this thing. Thanks for watching this Ranywayz random video. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.